Okay, well, welcome to Science and Prophecy in the Bible. This is class 4, and we're going to be talking about geology. The science of geology is just a study of the earth and the processes that formed it. It's very interesting and very much confirming of a young earth, as we'll see. Just some of the main points we're going to talk about. Every part of the world, millions of dead things are found buried in rock sediment layers laid down by water. We see that everywhere you look, whether it's in the lowest valley or even the highest mountains. They found seashells at the tops of Himalayan mountains. So you can see these rock sediments that have been laid down by water all over the world. And we're going to be looking at how this geology supports a young Earth. Look at why God even sent this flood to begin with, and then some of the mechanisms of the flood. Apparently there was a water canopy that surrounded the Earth in the early part of creation, and we'll look at that and how that collapse happened. Also, the aquifers bursting, so the water came up out of the ground as well to flood the Earth. And then we'll look at the water canopy. Is it even feasible from a physics standpoint? We'll actually look at a little bit of orbital mechanics to see if the water canopy is actually something that could happen. And they're going to find out that it actually definitely is possible. And then lastly, we'll look at the ancient Chinese language that shows evidence for the biblical flood. Very fascinating study of that language. So how did the Grand Canyon form? Of course, the typical, secular scientist would say that the Colorado River, carved the canyon over millions of years. But is that really true? What does the evidence say? We see the others, some of the very beautiful national parks we have all across the nation and the world as well. But this, in particular, this Arches National Park there in Utah, have these beautiful arches that have formed. And experts claim that slow erosional processes form these natural arches. But you would think, millions of years of erosion should have toppled all the arches by now. None should really exist. There's about 2,000 arches that are left currently in Arches National Park, and they see, 1.5 arches per year collapse. So just even the back of the envelope kind of math shows that well, if these are really millions of years old, how could they have still be any arches left if they're collapsing at that kind of rate? So it just doesn't really make much logical sense. And experiments show that sand arches can form fast, and that processes during Noah's flood could have easily formed these arches. Another interesting, neat picture of the Grand Staircase in Escalante National Park there in Utah. It's just an unmistakable water erosion in a location with very little water. I mean, you can see, some kind of whirlpool that was there for many, many months probably that carved out this little hole in the rock. And you can just see the grooves where water was obviously there. And of course, this is out in the middle of the desert. There's no water there currently to begin with. So there had to be water there at some point. Monument National Park in Utah, very evident of a global flood because you can see the erosion characteristics there. The top part of these monuments are more narrow and skinny that were eroded more during the turbulent time of Noah's flood. And then as the turbulence subsided and the floodwaters receded, you can see that less erosion happened. And so the base of these monuments are thicker. And then eventually the water dissipated out of the area. But you can definitely see this evidence of water erosion here, and again in a place where there really is no water. So it's very interesting monuments there that we can observe results of the global flood. So before we get right into all the geology that can take place, why did God send this flood? Very big topic there. So we'll spend the next hour and a half or so talking about this. So in Genesis 3, we can be reminded of this verse here, and this is God talking to the serpent right after they'd been caught by God sinning, and God's chastising the serpent and saying, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, and he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." So what offspring is that talking about? From just a high level standpoint, it's pretty obvious that, you have the offspring of a snake or a serpent, and the offspring of a woman would be, mankind. And then, of course, eventually the Hebrew people, and then eventually past that would be, Jesus himself coming from her offspring. But what would the offspring of uh, the serpent be, or Satan, who has inhabited this serpent? Well, we can kind of see that this end times battle between the Christ and the Antichrist is alluded to here at the beginning of all things. Christ is the Son of God who will eventually be the woman's offspring, and the Antichrist will be, quote, a son of Satan, eventually in the end times. But even before we get to that part that we'll discuss in the second part of the class in the coming weeks, uh, but even before we get there, Genesis 6, we talk about the Nephilim. This is chapter 6 of Genesis is probably one of the strangest chapters in all the Bible. It talks about these Nephilim. Here in verse 4, you say that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards, meaning after the flood. So they were there before the flood and after the flood. And it says, when the sons of God went to the daughters of man and had children by them, they were the heroes of old, men of renown. And that word Nephilim means tyrants or giants. And the sons of God, this is the Ben Elohim. And sometimes people think, well, these are not really angels. They were some other human race or something like that. But every time when it uses the term the Ben Elohim, that's talking about the angels as we think of. And these were just the fallen angels that had sexual relations with these daughters of men and had children by them. And these children were these giants that come upon the earth. So what were these Nephilim doing? Why was there such animosity really about this? And we can read about a little bit in Leviticus 18 and 19. Of course, the flood came because God said every inclination of man's heart was only evil, except for Noah and his family. But also there was the other part of what's going on in the world when we read in Leviticus 18, and it says, "And you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan." And of course, if you remember the story of the Hebrew children after they got to the promised land, they were in the land of Canaan and they observed all these giants. They said that they were grasshoppers, or they themselves were like grasshoppers in their eyes. So obviously, very stressful situation for the Hebrew people having all these giants running around in the land that God has given them. But what were these Nephilim doing in the land? And it gives a list of sexual immorality, men, animals, plants, textiles. God said not to mix kinds, and that's exactly what they were doing in the land of Canaan. Also in Genesis 6, it says Noah was a righteous man. It says blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. But the earth was corrupt and filled with violence, for all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. And so we see this contrast between blameless of Noah, who was righteous, is without blemish, he was undefiled, perfect in his generations. And the other word was corrupt, that was ruined, spoiled, or rotten, as in a fruit. So Noah and his family were the only ones left on earth who had not been defiled. Then, of course, after the flood of Genesis 6, we can see in the land of Canaan that God gave the Israelites, they found these peoples there that they called the Amalekites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and then the Anakites. The Anakites were the Nephilim. These were the giants of the land. And God told Israel to wipe out these people because of their evil practices and their defiled nature. Again, a little further in Genesis 6, it says, "And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them." So God is sorry that he even made all of man and all of the animals in the world. That's a pretty sad state there that the earth was in. The earth was also corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So God says it's not just mankind that's been corrupted and defiled, but these animals of the earth also had been corrupted. So how many people were on the earth when the flood happened? We can use an exponential factor to understand possibly how many people are on the earth. If you start with, of course, two people, Adam and Eve, and then use the current growth rate that we have today, is usually around 1 to 1.5% per year, and that would give you about 750 million to 4 billion people. So the earth had a lot of people in it during the time of the flood. And as I just said, the not only man had been corrupted, but also the beasts. And it's interesting when you look at Greek myths and other myths of the world, the ancient world, you see a lot of potentially this corruption it's talking about. Maybe there was some part to some of these Greek myths that we have read about. Many mythological stories from the ancient world frequently involve not only giants, but also corrupted animals. You have the Minotaur, which is a part bull and human, a centaur, a part horse and human. The god little g, Pan, was a part goat, part man. Egyptians worshiped the gods like Anubis that had the head of a dog and the body of a human. So, were these, somewhat based in truth? Could that have been the type of corruption of flesh God was talking about? Very interesting, but very kind of strange situation there for sure. So, who are these sons of God? I mentioned earlier that from a biblical standpoint, you shouldn't reconcile those as to be the fallen angels, the Ben Elohim. But other theologians have postulated that they were just powerful human rulers, or possibly descendants of Seth. But the problem with those last two, human rulers or descendants of Seth, they would have been married to human females. So why would that produce giants or heroes of old? And why would God pronounce such a harsh judgment on someone for actually procreating just as God had commanded to do? Of course, the potential weakness of view one about the fallen angels in Matthew 22, it indicates that angels do not marry. However, it does not say that angels are not able to have sexual relations. The fact that God's holy angels do not marry or engage in sexual relations does not mean the same is true for Satan and his demons. So it just may be that the angels choose not to marry um, due to their work that they're doing for God, or whatever the case is. But it doesn't necessarily say that they can't have sexual relations. And also, every instance in the Old Testament of sons of God being mentioned, this Ben Elohim, that always refers to angels. And of course, it's always best to use Scripture to interpret Scripture. When we look at in historical records, we see these people called the Anunnaki. They were known as the gods of the ancient world. They were children of the earth and sky that were giants that ruled over the people. That sounds kind of familiar, right? And the Israelites battled the Anakites, the children of Anak, in the Promised Land. And there are several references to them in Scripture. In Numbers 13, it says, "And they ascended by the south and came upon unto Hebron, where Ahiman, Shishai, and Talmai, the children of Anak." And Numbers 13 again, "And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there." Again, a little further down, "And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, as we were in their sight." In Deuteronomy 9, it says, "A people great and tall, the children of the Anakims, who can stand before the children of Anak?" And then in Judges 1:20, "And they gave Hebron unto Caleb, as Moses said, and he expelled the three sons of Anak." So the biblical record also shows these Anakites, and the secular world would say those are called the Anunnaki that were around in those times. We see the flood of Noah was approximately 2350 BC, and the Israelites moved into Canaan around 1450 BC. So the Nephilim had 900 years to settle Canaan. Apparently somehow Satan must have known that God's plan would eventually lead to the Hebrew people having the land of Canaan. Maybe that's why he put his seed, these Nephilim, in this land to try to thwart the Hebrew children from obtaining the land that God had planned for them. But regardless, they had 900 years after the flood to populate this land. Another reference to some of these giants in Deuteronomy 3, it talks about Bashan, the land of Bashan, we have this king called Og, and then also the Sihon, king of the Amorites. And it talks about smoting them until there none was left to him remaining. Then in verse 11, for only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of giants. And then it goes on to explain his bed that he had that was there, and in Rabbath of the children of Ammon. It says 9 cubits was the length, 4 cubits of the breadth, and in this whole land of Bashan, which is called the land of the giants. And of course, that cubit is around 1.5 feet. It's basically the length from a man's fist to their elbow, and a span is usually considered the span of a hand. But in any case, so this would be about a 13-foot long bed and a 6 foot wide bed, and it was located in there with the Ammonites in Rabbath. And apparently, it seems like this Sihon, king of the Amorites, was possibly a giant. And of course, the most famous giant was Goliath, and that's who David fought there in 1 Samuel 17, and gives a lot of detail there. It says that Goliath's height was 6 cubits and a span, and again, a span is the length of basically 6 inches around the length of uh, the size of a man's hand. It says he had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. And on his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. And his shield bearer went ahead of him. So, taking that into more units that we understand as far as the weight and size of things. So Goliath was from Philistine. He was a Philistine from the city of Gath. He was 9 feet 6 inches tall. His armor weighed 125 pounds. The tip of his spear weighed 15 pounds. And of course, he was killed by David around 1000 BC here. And of course, the scripture goes on to say that David went to the stream before he fought Goliath and picked out 5 smooth stones. And that's pretty interesting that he would do that. Goliath actually had 4 brothers. So it almost hints that David was uh, expecting to fight his 4 brothers too, and all he needed was 1 stone each. That's pretty confident there. So here's Goliath's brothers. We can read about them in 2 Samuel. Ishbi-Benob, he was killed by Abishai, David's nephew. He almost killed David. This was after a little bit later when David was getting older, and his nephew came to his rescue. Saph, he was killed by Sibbecai the Hushathite. Lami was killed by Elihanan the Bethlehemite. And then there was an unnamed giant with 6 fingers and 6 toes that was killed by Jonathan. So all totaled, as far as I know and count, in the Bible, there's at least 10 giants that are referenced in Scripture. We see Og and Sippai, Ahiman, Shishai, Talmai, and then, of course, Goliath, Lami, Ishbi-Benob, Saph, and then the unnamed giant. So we can kind of start to see Satan's strategy here. The first time around, he wants to pollute the human race with his seed, with these Nephilim. That was before the flood, and then actually they were there on the earth after the flood as well, trying it again. But also we see Abraham's seed was kind of polluted with Hagar and Ishmael. You have a worldwide famine was saved by Joseph. Destruction of the male line while they were in Egypt. Of course, I remember the Hebrews escaped Egypt, and then just to get trapped at the edge of the Red Sea with the Egyptian army bearing down on them with Pharaoh. And of course, God parted the Red Sea, and they escaped, and Pharaoh and his army were destroyed. But they were just about destroyed there. Populating Canaan with the Nephilim, that was a pretty big feat to fight off all these giants. David destroyed David's line, his bloodline of Jesus. We see that David fights against these descendants of the Nephilim throughout his career. So God sent the flood to keep the line of mankind pure, to ensure the virgin birth of Jesus. There's some other interesting verses related to that in Jude 6. We can read about the angels. It says they kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation. And that word habitation means they desired earthly clothing. And it says, He hath reserved an everlasting change under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. Even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth as an example for suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. And then we read kind of in contrast in 2 Corinthians 5, it says, For in this we groan, talking about Christians, groan earnestly, desiring to be clothed with our habitation, which is from heaven. So we're desiring, as Christians, our heavenly clothing, and these angels, unfortunately, desired earthly clothing. And in 2 Peter 2, it says, For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah. And that word habitation there in the Hebrew is oikiterion, referring to the body as a dwelling place for the spirit. It's only used twice in the Bible in these two locations. Also in Matthew 24, this is a whole chapter basically where Jesus is talking about the end times, and he's saying, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. So what was going on in the days of Noah? Well, we just read that there was a lot of mixing of kinds, that there was of course, the Nephilim were on the scene with a mixed breed of human and angel, and and it appears that maybe even the beasts were somehow mixed kinds. And currently, mankind is in today's world is attempting to mix kinds with various research, with stem cells, DNA, etc. They've produced a lot of different mixtures of different these different kinds of species. Of course, some of it is good research. Some of it, we've probably all heard of about a pig heart being put into a person and allowed them to live for at least a few more months more because of this mixture of kinds. But I'm not so sure that that's a good path we should be going down. It's a real slippery slope for sure. They've created this goat spider mixture. Spiders, if you put them in captivity in large amounts, they tend to kill each other and eat each other. But that spider silk is a very sought after material because it's very strong. It's stronger than steel of the same size. And you can imagine ropes or things that are material that might benefit from such a strong material. But what they did is they spliced in the gene of that makes the spider silk into a goat. And so that when the goat issues forth milk, it actually issues the spider silk as well. So there's a lot of weird things going on, and that's the least of it, really. Uh, in the magazine Live Science in 2019, they produced the first pig monkey that was created in China. And not only that, they went further and created a human monkey. That's very disconcerting. And even for them, they decided that there was definitely a controversial experiment, that these interspecies embryos were only allowed to develop for a month for ethical reasons, including the concern that human cells might grow in the chimera's brain and grant the animal human-like consciousness. I mean, this is what's going on. This was in 2019 in an official live science journal. So strange things are going on in the world today of mixing kinds. We can get a little more information about the creation of the world in Job 38. We're used to reading in Genesis about all the creation, but Job 38 also has some information. It says, Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it, whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So this is the occasion where Job had started to complain a little bit about his circumstances, and God's kind of chastising him a little bit and just saying, where were you when I created the earth? Who are you to be talking like this? But it's very interesting there in that end there, the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Well, those sons of God, well, that's the Ben Elohim. So that's the angels there that shouted for joy. They were there shouting because of the creation. And then the morning stars sang together. Yeah, that's a very interesting verse because who do we know are the morning stars? Well, Jesus is called that in Revelation 22 but Lucifer is also called that in Isaiah 14. Sometimes there's some doctrines that would say that Jesus and Lucifer were brothers, but that's just not the case. In Ezekiel 28, that talks about gives detail about Lucifer and what he looks like and all that. It talks about him being created, that in the day he was created. And of course, Jesus is the creator, so they can't be brothers. Jesus created Lucifer, and so that can't be the case. But at the same time, when you we'll look at this later when we get to the second part of our class, but uh, Lucifer actually was created with musical instruments embedded in his body. You can only see that if you read the King James version. It's not included in a lot of the other versions. But he had tambourines and cymbals embedded in his body, so it makes sense that maybe he was even a worship leader. Talks about his sanctuaries and stuff that he polluted. So there very well he may have been the one who was singing at this point, along with Jesus. God goes on to say in Job, verse 8 there of chapter 38, who shut up the sea with the doors when it brake forth, as if it had issued out of the womb? When I made the cloud the garment thereof, and thickness darkness a swaddling band for it. So God created this cloud or this vapor canopy that surrounds the earth and surrounded with thick darkness. In verse 12, it says, Hast thou commanded the morning since thy days, and caused the day spring to know his place, that it might take hold the ends of the earth, that the wicked might be shaken out of it? So we start this transition from the creation and we're starting to talk about the end times. And it's interesting, you see that those two counterparts quite a bit in Scripture, where there's a creation part and then there's the end times part. Everything from Second Peter in the New Testament, as well as here in the Old Testament, we see this, where the wicked are shaken out of the earth at the end of the 70th week. It is turned as clay to the seal, and they stand as a garment. And from the wicked their light is withholden, and the high arm shall be broken. That high arm is referring to the Antichrist, who will be defeated at the end of the 70th week. Verse 22, hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow, or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war? So again, that time of trouble, that's talking about Jacob's trouble. Read about that in Jeremiah 30, verse 7. And the day of battle and war, that's talking about Armageddon. So again, there's this end times connection with the creation. So apparently God's going to use snow and hail during this end times week. So there's the verse in Job that we just read. And in verse 9 there, it says, I made the cloud the garment thereof, and thick darkness a swaddling band for it. And there's kind of a counterpart verse in Genesis chapter 1, where God said he made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it, and the water under the sky to be gathered to one place. So we see that there was this water canopy that apparently was there around the earth, as well as, of course, water on the earth that was there with the land gathered all into one place, sometimes called Pangea, as a kind of a one continent for the world there in pre-flood. And of course, the flood happened around 2245 BC or so, and that's when the continental breakup started to happen. The aquifers were burst forth as we read, and so there was definitely some tectonic plate action that happened during that time. And then, of course, the world today, we see the continents that are separate. And really, if you take a globe and look at it, you can see where the continents were fit together at some point, at least very closely together. Of course, we know that people lived much longer pre-flood. We saw that with the Genesis 5 of the patriarchs that we listed, and Methuselah lived 969 years. A lot of them lived many, many years, centuries. And of course, their lifespans drastically fell off after the flood um, because of definitely different environment for sure. But this water vapor canopy probably protected from radiation from the atmosphere, from the stellar explosions, gamma radiation, solar radiation, those kind of things that probably helped keep people in better health and live longer. We also see that there are larger animals and insects. That probably there was a greater oxygen content in the early atmosphere. Well, they've proven that animals can grow bigger if they have a greater percentage of oxygen that they're breathing. Maybe that's why the dinosaurs were so big, was because they were breathing a much purer atmosphere. There's also been fossils of like a dragonfly that has almost a 3 foot wingspan that they say, wouldn't be able to even fly in this day and time with our current atmosphere. So something was definitely different. Somehow the atmosphere was thicker in the early part of creation. And of course, at the end of the flood, God shows Noah the rainbow, and that's his promise to never flood the earth again. And so that really kind of insinuates that there had never been a rainbow before. Well, if there couldn't have been a rainbow before, there had to have been some other mechanism for how the atmosphere was. There couldn't have been clouds and rain and things like that. Of course, the scripture does say it had never rained until the flood started, and we'll read about that here in just a minute. And of course, it would also provide a uniform global climate. And we found, fossil ferns in polar regions and all around the world that show us that there was a very temperate climate in the early time frames. And again, we see this Pangea, this one supercontinent, and that would have allowed animals to migrate, all types of animals to migrate to Noah's Ark wherever he was, and through a very small amount of water, they might have had to go across through over land bridges and things like that. So definitely supports the idea of the biblical flood. Of course, answers in Genesis, they're one of the really good creation um, biblical account ministries. They built a full-size Noah's Ark there in Kentucky. And probably a lot of you have seen that, but very impressive. And of course, we read about the size of that ark. It was 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high. So very large vessel for sure. But a very interesting verse in Genesis 6 too. It says, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years." So some folks might say that, well, telling man that they're only going to live 120 years, and that's going to be their lifespan. But we saw that the patriarchs lived far longer than that. Even the very last one, Jacob, I think he lived 147. So that definitely was not a decree by God to say that lifespan was only 120 years. This is where God is saying it'll be 120 years from this point when I will send the flood. So Noah has 120 years to build this ark. Genesis 7 gives us some details about the animals that come to the ark. And, a lot of, especially the children's Sunday school books and stuff will show the animals coming two by two and that kind of thing. But, actually, there were 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate. And then there was 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate. And then God tells Noah that 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made. And of course, they came, every wild animal according to its kind, every creature that moves along the ground, every bird, everything that has wings, they all came to Noah. So there were 7 clean and 1 unclean pairs that came to the ark. And after Noah finished his ark, he gave 7 days for it to be there, for all the animals to be there. And were dinosaurs included in the ark? Yes. They don't have to be adult. They could be, teenage range dinosaurs. They would be much smaller. Um, and also keep in mind that the conditions during the flood, we'll talk about this in a minute, but most likely they were, very winter-like conditions. So these animals probably went into hibernation and that kind of thing. So they were much smaller, didn't have to be the huge dinosaurs that we see today in museums, that they would have been the teenage versions of them that would have been much smaller. Also, have to keep in mind, man and animals were vegetarian, and the animals had no fear of man in the early days. In Genesis 1, it says, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with it, seed in it, that will be yours for food, and I will give you every green plant for food. But on the post-flood, now all of a sudden animals do fear man, and now they were all also man-eaters, including humans. And God said, everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. So one question that's asked a lot of times is, well, you got all those animals, could they all fit in the ark? Well, that's a very good question. Um, so let's look at that. The volume of the ark, he gives us the length, width, and height, so we can calculate that volume, that 1.5 million cubic feet. And if we kind of break it down into more understandable parts, the volume of a railroad car is around 5,000 cubic feet. So there's over 300 railroad cars that could fit inside Noah's Ark. And so one boxcar, it holds about 200 sheep. So that means the Ark could have held over 60,000 animals that were the size of the sheep. And sheep is known to be about the average size. If you take the average size of all animals, it turns out to be about the size of a sheep. So that's a really pretty good estimation. Also, we see that Noah's Ark was constructed using a 1:6 ratio. Naval architecture reveals that this length to width ratio is the most stable for ocean going vessels. And a lot of the naval ships use that ratio, 1:6. And so that's very interesting. How could Noah, who's out in the middle of the woods someplace, it wasn't like these people were ocean going people. He built this boat according to God's instructions, and it's exactly the right optimal ratio for being on the ocean. It just shows again the supernatural part of the scriptures. So again, how many animals on the ark? Most likely they had the younger teenage type animals. They most likely hibernated due to the dark winter-like conditions. And it was estimated back then that there were about 2,000 different kinds. These days, there's a lot of different kinds because of all the breeding that has gone on across the world. But back then, there may have only been one cat kind, or that's all you needed because the DNA, the instructions for making the other kind of cat kinds were embedded in that one kind. And so when you take that into account, there were 7 times 2 or 14 of the clean kinds we know of. So if you just divided up this 2,000 kinds into 1,000 clean and 1,000 unclean, well, that would give you 14,000 animals. And then the one pair of the unclean kinds of the 1,000 different kinds, well, that would give you 2,000. So that would only give you a total of 16,000 animals. So, and again, we said a while ago that it could have held over 60,000 animals. So it seems like there's plenty of room in the ark for all the animals. So Genesis 7, this is where the floodgates have been opened. It says, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heaven were opened. And it says, the waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. So again, that 15 cubits times 15 or 22 and a half feet. So the waters rose to 22 and a half feet above the highest mountains. Probably that, they didn't have the Himalayas and the Rockies and all that sort of thing back in those days. Those mountain ranges were pushed up through because of the flood. So they were post-flood type anomalies that happened. But most likely the earth was much flatter as far as the surface of the earth goes before the flood. So it's kind of interesting that's significant about that depth of coverage. That was half the height of the ark. And of course, that would be about the flotation depth of the ark. So that also shows God's care in the fact that the water only had to recede just a few feet before the ark could find rest, but at the same time keep it safe from obstacles as it floated above the highest mountain peaks. We can get some interesting timelines that were there in Genesis 7 through 9. We see the flood starting on the 17th day of the second month, and then it ended on the 17th day of the seventh month. And it rained for 40 days, of course it says, and between those two dates it gives, that's 150 days. Then the next time marker, it says that on the first day of the 10th month, they see the mountaintops. Well, that's another 74 days. And then the first day of the first month, the water begins to dry up. That's another 90 days. And then the 27th day of the second month, the earth is completely dry, and Noah and his family leave the ark. That's another 56 days for a total of 370 days. So Noah was in the ark for 1 year and 10 days. So Noah and his family came out of the ark on that 27th day of the second month. This shows that Noah waited for God to tell him it was okay to leave the ark. I'm sure he saw that the ground was drying up and all that, but he waited for God to tell him to leave. Then he sacrificed some of all of the clean animals and birds. God knew that man would now eat meat, so he made sure that there was enough clean animals for him to make sacrifices as well as for food. God said he would never curse the ground or destroy all living things. God put the fear of man into animals. And for the first time, God allows man to eat meat. Man and animal were vegetarian before, but now they're meat eaters. And of course, God made a covenant with man with the rainbow. And that first rainbow shows the atmosphere must be different now after the flood. Okay, so the ark lands, and we're not exactly sure where, but probably someplace in Turkey or Saudi Arabia, someplace around in that region of the world. But we see the descendants that of Noah's children, of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we can read about some of that in Genesis chapter 10 that talks about the descendants of Noah's kids. And we see that Japheth went to Europe, Shem went to Asia, and Ham went to Africa. We also read about this fellow named Peleg. He was one of the patriarchs there. And it says, for in his days the earth was divided. Well, his name actually means division. And so most likely that's talking about this episode of the Tower of Babel. We'll read more about that later, but Nimrod was on the earth in those days, and he was probably the first world dictator. And he's the one that instigated the peoples to build this tower. And he was the one that uh, really caused the people to sin, really, because God had told them to spread out into the world, and they didn't. They congregated here at this Tower of Babel. And of course, God confused their languages and then divided the peoples because of that. And because of those divisions of languages, they uh, migrated across the world in this fashion. And we see the Tower of Babel is around, approximately 2300 to 2200 BC, around 100 years after the flood. We see this interesting account of Josephus. He was a first century Jewish historian, but he wrote in one of his history books, says, after this they were dispersed abroad on account of their languages and went out by colonies everywhere, and each colony took possession of the land they lied upon and to which God led them. There were some who passed over the sea in ships. So it kind of shows that maybe this is where some of them actually maybe made it here onto our continent at that point. We don't know for sure, but there's at least some evidence from 2,000 years ago from Josephus saying that they did. We can kind of glean some things too from looking at the patriarch timeline relative to the flood. Noah lived 950 years. He was born around 1056 years after creation. He died around 2006 years after creation. And it says that sons were born to Noah when he was 500 years old. So that would have been around 1556 years after creation. And of course, God had already said that a judgment was coming, and He give the world 120 years before this flood. He didn't necessarily say flood at that point, at least not in the scriptures. Of course, He had Noah building an ark, so they knew it was coming. Methuselah and was uh, Noah's grandfather, and Lamech was Noah's father. And of course, Methuselah died the very year the flood came, and Lamech died about 5 years before the floods. But at least Noah had them as to consult about and how to build this ark and how to deal with what the coming catastrophe was going to happen. And then we see Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They're born, like I said, 500 years after Noah uh, or in his life. Shem lived about 600 years. That doesn't give us a date for Ham and Japheth. The interesting thing is Japheth was actually the eldest, um, but it talks about in Genesis 10:21 about Japheth being the elder. But yet Shem is listed first. It's kind of an interesting thing we'll talk about. So points to ponder, Noah was 600 years old when the flood came. So then he builds the ark for 120 years. He was 500 when he had his sons, and his sons were about 100 years old at the flood. Did he wait that long to have children, or were there others who had been corrupted? That's a long time to not have children. Noah was 500 years old when he had his first children, so it says, or at least he had Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Were there other children before that? And maybe they had become corrupted along with the rest of the world. And then, of course, even Shem, Ham, and Japheth, they were only 100, which was kind of young for back then. So maybe they really didn't have children by then, but they certainly already had wives, and you'd think that they would have already had children as well. And again, like I mentioned about Japheth being firstborn, your birth order is a big deal in Hebrew culture. Yet the elder Japheth is listed last. Why? We'll talk about this in the second part of the class, but um, when you look at the descendants of Japheth, he really um, it was not some good descendants. We talked about Gog and Magog and all that. Gog was a military tyrant that tried to take over a lot of the world and took over or tried to take over Israel in the end times that we'll eventually get to. And they all were descendants of Japheth. And of course, Shem, the descendants of Shem, is the Hebrew people, and Jesus is considered part of that. So the descendants apparently have um, caused the reorder of the sons to be Shem, Ham, and Japheth instead of the proper birth order like it typically would be. All right, well, so we see in the fossil record this flood occurred, and we see this remains of living plants and animals. And of course, at the top part of the Earth's crust, you kind of see the soft rock layers. These are the sediments that contain the fossils. This is around 25 to 60 miles deep. But then after that, you get to the hard rock layer. This is the granite and the volcanic. There's no fossils at this point. So all the fossils are at the upper part. Um, so in these fossils, the land vertebrates, the plants, reptiles, fish, single-celled organisms, they're all there. Even including marine fossils in the Himalayas. They've all been seen there, even on the highest mountains. And again, no transitional fossils have ever been found throughout this sediment layers. And these marine fossils are found at the highest altitudes, including Mount Everest, and on all 5 continents. The gradual evolution process that's typically talked about shows that it was 570 million years from the time of the first single-celled organism that replicated and eventually evolved and became all the animals that we see today. That's the gradual evolution process. However, the biblical process is very quick, and you see these layers being laid down by water, and animals being caught up in the mud flows and just being buried. And if you think about it, the smallest animals who maybe are more sedentary and stationary are going to be caught first and be buried the quickest and the first. And as the animals get more mature and they're livelihoods. They're able to move and maybe run away from some of the floodwaters and maybe even have be smart enough to uh, go to higher ground and things like that. Those are the ones that are going to be buried last. And so this 1 year flood that we saw is exactly what we see. So, especially, as earth dams break during the global flood, there's the less mobile creatures are the ones that get caught up first. And one of the interesting things is too, if this really took millions of years, when we in these layers, then you would think you'd see evidence of streams and rivers and multiple layers as you go down. I mean, why wouldn't there be streams and rivers, millions of years ago? But yet you don't see any evidence of that. The only place you see evidence of streams and rivers are only found in the top fossil layer. So it's the same fossil record, but just different uh, mechanism of how it all came about, depending on whether you believe in evolution or the creation story. So we all view the same fossil record but have different conclusions. One key point too is how do we see intact animals in the fossil record? They should have been decayed or even eaten. If this is taking millions of years, an animal dies and then lays on the ground. Well, we all know, I mean, even in our modern society, you see uh, a dead turtle on the side of the road, or a dog is hit or something like that. The coyotes come, or whatever predators, the birds come, and they eat that carcass, and within a matter of days, that carcass is gone. And you don't see that really in the fossil record. You see these animals being buried completely, that are fully there. There's nothing. I mean, some of them are buried so pristinely that they look like they could get up and walk away. Very much so. So I want to show you this little video from this is from Institute for Creation Research, and it has a really good uh, fossil explanation. So let's listen to what they have to say.
Do fossils really show that creatures gradually evolved from simple to complex? The late fossil expert and evolution defender Stephen Gould recognized they didn't. He said the fossil record shows two clear features. One, sudden appearance, and two, stasis. When a new creature is discovered in the fossil record, it shows up suddenly and fully formed, with no gradual forms that led up to it. That's sudden appearance. Then its basic form stays the same. It doesn't evolve. And that's stasis. All kinds of fossilized creatures show sudden appearance and stasis, including creatures like crinoids, mosasaurs, beardworms, horseshoe crabs, lobsters, and trilobites. Rather than gradual evolution, the fossil record shows each animal form suddenly appears. Trilobites have perfectly formed body parts right from the start. They show up suddenly with no ancestors and have some of the most complex eyes that ever existed on Earth. Does that sound like slow, gradual evolution? They first occur in Cambrian rocks, which often represent the first deposits from Noah's flood. But even when found high above Cambrian rocks, trilobites still look like trilobites, as though they were created to reproduce more of their own kind. In The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin hoped future fossil finds would show examples of in-between creatures demonstrating evolution. So far, it's just more stasis. Creatures appear suddenly, fully formed, and they keep the same form. And that's what we'd expect to find. God's fully formed creation we read about in the book of Genesis.
Yeah, pretty neat description there. Again, sudden appearance and stasis are confirmed in the fossil record, even by evolutionists. Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980. And it's just one of the great examples of how a catastrophic event can shape our world very quickly. It was a great boon to creation scientists as well. It produced much evidence for a young Earth. Fossilization was seen within days of the eruption. Canyon formations within weeks. Let's look at a video here of this Mount St. Helens. Very telling of what can happen during these very volatile and cataclysmic type events.
On May 18, 1980, Mount St. Helens, located 95 miles south of Seattle, Washington, erupted. The eruption was triggered by an earthquake centered beneath the mountain that measured 5.1 on the Richter scale. The lateral blast swept out the north side of Mount St. Helens at 300 miles per hour. With temperatures as high as 660 degrees Fahrenheit and the power of 24 megatons of thermal energy, it snapped 100-year-old trees like toothpicks and stripped them of their bark. Before the famous eruption at Mount St. Helens, scientists were mostly familiar with slow-acting examples of geologic change. But at Mount St. Helens, geologists watched the Earth's surface change quite rapidly. Icebergs were buried in hot avalanche material. They melted and formed badlands in days. Eruptions on May 18 and June 10 produced fine layers in hours. On June 10, mud flows cut zigzag canyons 100 feet deep in soft sand and mud, complete with perpendicular side canyons. Canyons that are reminiscent of the geography of Grand Canyon, only 40 times smaller and clearly produced within hours. Mud flows over the following decade cut hundreds of feet into solid rock in just days of cutting time. Fallen trees formed a log mat on the surface of Spirit Lake and dropped bark to the bottom of the lake, accumulating up to 3 feet of bark peat in just a couple years. And vertically floating logs sinking to the bottom of the lake resulted in buried trees in only a decade, similar to the trees of Yellowstone's fossil forest, which are also buried in volcanic layers. Even though Mount St. Helens is a very small catastrophe compared to the flood or the major catastrophes immediately following the flood, it provides a better clue to what happened in those times than the slow geologic processes which are most commonly seen in the present.
Yeah, very insightful documentary there. And one of the key points there, and they had it up on the screen there in 2 Peter 3, is for this they willingly forget, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. So they willingly forget. That's a very good point. Some evidences of the geology of a water laid down sediment. We see these deformations in solid rock. It had to be soft before those deformations happened. If it was hard as we see today, it would have been very brittle and crumbled at really the smallest amount of bending. But to have that big of a bend, as we see there in that picture, that would have had to have happened very quickly and had to have happened when it was still moist and wet. And so how could that layer be millions of years old? It had to have been laid down very quickly. Polystrate fossils, that's another one. These are fossils that extend upward through multiple layers of sediment. We see these fossils of trees here. And they could not have been slowly deposited over thousands or millions of years. The tree would have decayed in that amount of time, right? So this was a tree that was buried within these fossil layers very quickly, and then the tree was fossilized and turned into rock over time. Petrified stumps. We see these a lot in our national parks. Yellowstone or Glacier National Park have some of these type tree stumps. And the park signs will claim these fossilized trees are millions of years old. But they have no evidence of a root system in the soil around them. They did not grow in the location they now occupy. These trees were torn loose and transported by water and deposited very rapidly. Similar to what we just saw in the video with Mount St. Helens, the heavy part of the tree was drawn down by gravity and then eventually settled on the bottom of where the water was, and then the water dissipated, and the tree was just left standing in this vertical position, and then was fossilized with all the chemicals and everything from that volcanic activity seeping into the tree bark and the pressure and everything that was there. All right, radiometric dating. This is a big one because a lot of our secular scientists would say, rocks are billions and millions of years old, and they get that from this process called radiometric dating. But there's a lot of assumptions made in this process of this dating method. Basically, this method looks at the parent isotope, which is some kind of radioactive element like uranium or rubidium, and it has a half-life that we've measured. And these half-lives are, like for uranium, for example, would be 4.5 billion years. Rubidium is 48.8 billion years. Of course, the concept is that half the material decays in that amount of time. But that's rate that we can measure today is not necessarily the rate that it was whenever the rock was created, for one thing. But the biggest reason that the radiometric dating is highly inaccurate is because you don't know how much of the parent atom and how much of the daughter atom are there at the beginning of the process of the rock being formed. You have this volcanic activity, it spills lava out on the ground, then eventually it cools and then solidifies, and you have these rocks, and then we come and measure what that rock is like, and we don't know what other rocks around it may have been merged in with it and melted in with it that had daughter atoms of the same element, and what how many parent atoms it actually started with. We just don't know. You can kind of see a little bit about that in the equation that they use. Uh, the T there is the age of the rock. The lambda is the decay constant, which being constant is very highly suspect. And then you take the natural log of 1 plus the daughter atoms, number of daughter atoms over the parent atoms. And those are the daughter atoms we measure today and the parent atoms we measure today, but they are not the same as that it was when the rock was created. So the time can't be correct. And these methods have been shown to give erroneously long ages to rocks of known age. Actually, there was a newly formed rocks from a recent eruption of Mount Ngauruhoe in New Zealand. So the rocks were literally months old because they were observed to be seen to be created at that time. And yet, the radiometric dating shown them to be 270,000 to 3.9 billion years old. And they used various dating methods. Well, number one, they're only months old, so that's definitely wrong answer. But number two, they use various dating methods and they still have this very wide range, 270,000 to 3.9 billion years. I mean, at least get the number consistent. So that shows that their dating methods are very widely not accurate. So recent experiments have shown that current dating methods can be as much as 1 billion times faster due to certain environmental factors, especially pressure. Carbon-14 dating, that's another common one that's used, and that's used from organic material. Diamonds are considered to be one of the oldest minerals on Earth. They were formed from organic material in the early years of the Earth. Dark specks in diamonds are carbon-14. But the half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years, meaning half the carbon-14 material decays into nitrogen in just 5,730 years. So if these diamonds are really formed at the beginning of the Earth, which they say is 4.5 billion years old, then how could there actually be any carbon-14 left in diamonds? When we go to the jewelry store and we look at diamonds, especially if you're getting one for your fiance and ready to get married and all that, and part of the journey of getting the right diamond is how clear is it, and how many specks do you see in it? The clearer it is and the less specks you see, then the more expensive it is. Well, those specks are carbon-14. Well, how could they be, if half of it's disappearing into nitrogen every 5,730 years, there shouldn't be any specks left at all. All the diamonds that we see ought to be very clear and clean. Radioisotope dating is a similar thing. Zircon crystals are one of the oldest stones that contains uranium, which decays into helium atoms. So there shouldn't be no helium atoms that should be left at all. When I took an archaeology class in college, years ago, and sometimes they would go out to Native American sites and gather artifacts and things, and then they would send it off to the lab to be analyzed to figure out how old it was. And they would always put a control material in with it, some material that they knew exactly how old it really was, and so it would make sure the lab gave them a good result of their age. And invariably, they'd have to send it off to 3 or 4 different labs. And one would say, well, this is 1,000 years old, and this would say this is 1,500 years old, and then the control material they would get totally wrong many times, most of the time actually. And so it just shows that you're just it's just the luck of the draw whether you get the right age of these materials right. So inaccuracies in dating methods can cause a wide range of errors when evaluating the age of material. Multiple labs are often used in archaeology with a control material of known age to help discern accurate dates. So next time you see a documentary that tells you that this rock or this material is a certain age, I would definitely raise an eyebrow on that one. Here's a good example and a good video of radiometric dating. It's kind of it's a complicated subject, but they kind of break it down into more understandable components. But let's take a look at this video.
Nearly every textbook and science magazine teaches that the Earth is billions of years old, and the primary dating method used for determining this is what is called radioisotope dating, or radiometric dating. Now, this is a reliable method for measuring absolute ages of rocks and the age of the Earth, right? First off, many scientists now regard the age of the Earth to be between 4.55 and 4.6 billion years old. Okay, so if this method is reliable and accurate, why the 50 million year discrepancy? That seems like a lot. But let's get into some details here and see what's going on. Keep in mind that there's all kinds of scientific jargon on this topic, and so we'll just present a very straightforward, simplified version of the process. Radiometric dating is the process of estimating the ages of rocks based on the decay of radioactive elements in them. Basically, there are certain kinds of atoms in nature that are unstable and spontaneously decay into other kinds of atoms. For instance, uranium will radioactively decay through a series of steps until it becomes the stable element called lead. The original element is called the parent element, and the end result is called the daughter element. Radioisotope dating is commonly used to date igneous rocks, rocks which formed when hot molten material cooled and solidified. The dating clock started when the rock cooled. During the molten state, it is assumed that the intense heat forced any gaseous daughter elements to escape. It is assumed that once the rock cooled, no more atoms escaped, and any daughter element now found in the rock is a result of radioactive decay since that rock formed. The decay rate is measured in terms of half-life, that is, the length of time it takes half of the remaining atoms of a radioactive parent element to decay. Now, of course, that can be measured in a laboratory, and it is assumed that since we know the decay rate, we can calculate backwards and come up with the age of the rock. But is that all there is to it? Here's where it gets tricky. It's true we can measure a decay rate using observational science, but there's another kind of science that is required to accurately calculate dates for rocks, and that is what we call historical science. Historical science deals with the things in the past, and therefore cannot be repeated and tested. Dating methods require both types of science, because in order to get accurate rock dates, one would have to accurately know both the decay rate and the initial conditions of the rock sample, right? Since radioisotope dating uses both types of science, we can't directly measure the ages of rocks. There are assumptions involved. For instance, how do we know what the initial conditions were in the rock sample? How do we know the amounts of parent or daughter elements now in that sample haven't been altered by other processes in the past? How does someone know the decay rate has remained constant since the rock formed? The answer is they don't. Let's simplify here and talk about a typical hourglass. Let's say you walk into a room and you see an hourglass with sand at the top and sand at the bottom, and some sand sprinkling from the top chamber to the bottom. Well, observational science would allow us to see and measure the sand, and then calculate how long the hourglass has been running, right? We could make our sand measurements and then calculate when the hourglass was turned over, right? Well, those calculations could be wrong, because we may have failed to consider some major assumptions, like, was there any sand at the bottom when the hourglass was turned over? Has any sand been added or taken out of the hourglass? Has the sand always been falling at a constant rate? Since we did not observe the initial conditions when the hourglass started, and we haven't been watching the sand all the time since then, we must make assumptions. All three of those assumptions can affect our time calculations. Now, of course, there's more to understanding all of this, but enough said.
So a cute little video, but very descriptive and accurate in what it's talking about. Radiometric dating is highly dependent on assumptions, and if those assumptions are wrong, then the dates will be wrong. There's the old saying, garbage in, garbage out, and that's exactly what we see in a lot of evolutionary type dating methods. So geologic evidence points to a global flood, just as the Bible says. Worldwide sediment layers, evidence of erosion by water are all over the world. We see millions of dead things buried in sediment layers laid down by water all over the world, from the lowest valleys to the highest mountains. So very much evidence of a global flood. Speaking of the flood, again, we've talked about it a little bit before, but there are two mechanisms there in Genesis 7 that talk about the flood. The great deeps were burst forth and the floodgates of heaven. In Genesis 2, we see the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground, but streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground, and a river watering the garden flowed from Eden. So we can see that these aquifers that were underneath the ground, full of water that bubbled up from underground and watered the plants thereof. There was no rain on the earth at that point. But then we see in Genesis 7, in the 600th year of Noah's life, that all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of heaven were opened. And rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. So we see there's two mechanisms there: the floodgates of heaven, this water canopy collapsed and burst forth on the earth, but then also the springs burst forth from under the earth. And so according to that scripture, it appears that it never rained until the flood came. That's pretty interesting. And we give a further confirmation of that in Hebrews 11:7, where it says, "By faith Noah, being warned of God, things not yet seen." So God had never, or excuse me, Noah had never seen rain before, and so by faith he just considered himself to be a servant of God and obeyed God and considered that these floods were coming. So the first part, all the springs of the great deep burst forth. So what could have caused the aquifers to burst? That word burst, the Hebrew word baka, means to cleave asunder or to divide. The signification of cleaving and opening as proceeding from striking. So it appears from the text that something struck the earth that caused the aquifers to burst. So what could have struck the earth with enough force to burst the aquifers? So scientists have long expressed the idea that meteors killed the dinosaurs. Geological evidence does support cataclysmic meteor impacts on a worldwide scale. And secular scientists would say that the impacts occurred 65 million years ago. But of course, it looks to me like they appeared as part of the global flood that happened at Noah's time. And we're going to look at one of the biggest meteor impacts in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula here in just a second. So in Apollo 14, Alan Shepard was on the moon and he grabbed one of these rocks, and it appeared that a moon rock was rich in oxygen and identical to those on Earth. And interestingly, the rock resembles those that form at a depth of 20 kilometers below the Earth's surface, the same depth as the Yucatan crater. Water in the form of ice was also detected on the moon's surface. This may have also come from Earth as well as due to meteor impacts. This rock could have potentially been ejected from the impact site and hurled into orbit where it later impacted the moon. So a lot of the moon rocks that we see and even the water that we see on the moon may have actually come from the Earth, just because you had these meteor strikes that hit the Earth so hard that it ejected the material out into space and eventually landed on the moon. So this crater there in Yucatan Peninsula, it's the Chicxulub crater. It's 100 kilometers wide and 20 kilometers deep. And so they estimate the meteor was probably 15 kilometers wide, that weighed 5 to the 17th, 10 to the times 10 to the 17th power kilograms, and came in at 35 kilometers a second. And this is really one of the worst places on the planet that it could have hit due to the high concentration of gypsum. This vaporized gypsum caused a dense sulfur dioxide cloud around the Earth and dramatically reduced sunlight and dropping worldwide temperatures. Subsurface surface hydrothermal activity leaked into the oceans. This, of course, raised ocean temperatures. Most likely caused tsunamis potentially as high as 2.9 miles. Now, this thin layer of clay that's found all over the world contains iridium, 6 parts per billion compared to a normal zero point 0.4 parts per billion in the KPG boundary. That's just one of the archaeological boundaries that they measure, and they find this clay boundary that has this high concentrate in it. Evidence of multiple impacts from other craters that appear to have occurred at the same time. We see multiple impacts at 20 to 70 degrees north latitude. And of course, these conditions are what's needed for an ice age. Aerosols to block sunlight and lower temperatures, and then you have warm oceans to promote precipitation. So basically, the ice and snow came as a result of these lower temperatures, and then now the renewed rain and snow that would have come. And they identified this crater in part by the strange changes in gravitational measurements in the area. They have very sensitive gravity instruments that can measure any kind of anomalies in the gravitational force. And they saw that this highly dense ground structure that affected even the local gravity. And they can even see the direction of the impact that can be seen from this gravity anomaly. So it looks like that this impact was nearly due south and possibly even could have been so hard that it tipped the Earth in this direction. Consider what Isaiah says in Isaiah 24. This is written around 700 BC. To see the Lord is going to lay waste the earth and devastate it. He will ruin its face and scatter its inhabitants. The earth is broken up. The earth is split asunder. The earth is violently shaken. The earth reels like a drunkard. It sways like a hut in the wind. So heavy upon it is the guilt of its rebellion that it falls never to rise again. And so we see, even with the current state of the earth, that it has a rotation that we all know about, but also has this precession and nutation motion that it has. Because the earth is tilted and it's rotating at the same time as it's tilted. So that gives us this precession. And then it actually has a small little wiggle in its precession called a nutation. We can kind of see some little short animations here that shows this precession and nutation. So could these meteor impacts have really tipped the Earth? We won't go through all the gory details of this math, but all objects have what's called a moment of inertia. And if you can overcome the moment of inertia, then you will move that object. And with the Earth analysis I'm doing here, I'm calculating the resistant torque of the Earth based on the Earth's moment of inertia. And we're going to compare it with the torque that the meteor hit the Earth at. And so if the meteor hit the Earth with a torque greater than the Earth's resistant torque, then it's going to make the Earth move. So that resistant torque of the Earth is around 2.6 times 10 to the 29th Newton meters. And if we use the estimated properties of that meteor coming in at 35 kilometers per second and weighing at 5 times 10 to the 17th kilograms, you can get a torque that happened to occur at the location of the Yucatan, and we'll get a torque of 2 times 10 to the 29th Newton meters. Now, it's not quite the same. It's just slightly less, but remember there were multiple meteor strikes, but very similar. That's interesting that it's even similar to what the Earth's estimated resistant torque would be. So using that estimated mass and velocity of the Chicxulub meteor, the torque applied to the Earth would have been very close to overcoming the Earth's resistant torque. And with multiple impacts, it's very plausible that the Earth was actually tipped over by meteor strikes. Our current post-flood seasons, you can see that the Earth is tilted in its orbit as it orbits the sun. And a lot of times people think that the Earth is closer to the sun during the summer months, but that's actually the opposite is true. It's actually closer to the sun in the winter months. What brings you the hot or cold is based on how the Earth is tilted toward the sun or away from the sun. So you can see in the summer solstice, the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun, and therefore we have a higher heat during that time frame. But the pre-flood was probably different. Probably the Earth was upright, and it probably had a more circular orbit, so it given it a much more temperate climate, as well as producing these ferns and fossils that we see in the polar and desert regions. One of the greatest discoveries in paleontology for Australia, says one of the lead authors, is this prehistoric amber that they found. They found um, uh, very interesting ferns and conifers and flowering plants, perfectly preserved ants and flies. And supposedly it came during the Cretaceous period from 92 to 96 million years ago. And yet all these plants and small little insects, they're no different from modern plants and insects. They look exactly the same. And of course, this happened in a place that these animals don't exist and these plants don't exist. So evolution has placed the southeastern part of Australia close to the South Pole at about 70 to 80 degrees south latitude during the Cretaceous period. Of course, that could be perfectly fine. That could actually be correct because the much more temperate climate that would have happened pre-flood. So the low sunlight and cold temperatures at low altitude, along with months of darkness, how could these types of plants grow in this environment, as months of darkness? The global flood is the answer. Model shows rapid tectonic plate motion during the flood and places Australia further north. Also, upright Earth allowed for more temperate climates. Okay, so now let's switch gears now to the second mechanism. We looked at the aquifers bursting forth, but the second mechanism was the water canopy surrounding the Earth. Does that really make sense? This is a very interesting analysis here. So we're going to estimate the volume of water in that canopy. We're going to estimate the orbital altitude of the water canopy and then also the thickness of that water canopy. So just to kind of give a graphic here, you have the Earth in the center, and then this water canopy is at some distance away from the Earth. And of course, it has a certain thickness to it. That Ri would be the inner radius of the canopy, with the Ro be the outer radius of the canopy. So you can think of it as like a hollow shell um, that this canopy represents. Well, of course, if it's orbiting around the Earth, there's going to have gravity pulling on it, and you're also going to have a centripetal force that's going to be pulled on it. And for two these two forces have to be equal to each other for there to be a stable orbit. The gravity force has to be equal to the centripetal force that's exerted on it. So if we set those two equations together, we won't go through all the gory details, but if we uh, can calculate the Ri there, we get that cubic root equation there, and it turns out it's 22,236 miles orbit altitude. Well, that's a well-known geostationary altitude for many satellites, especially weather and communication satellites. If you want to have a weather satellite that's always going to be looking over the United States, well, you don't want it traveling around all over the different parts of the world. You want it to be constantly sitting over the United States. Well, to do that, you have to be in geostationary orbit so that it orbits along at the same rate as the Earth rotates. And of course, this orbit also is far enough away from the Earth that tidal forces are significantly reduced. That typically cause orbital decay. And so we see that the orbit would be stable at that point. So we've got some key assumptions. We're going to be looking at the precipitation rate and then the orbit altitude. If you look at the Guinness Book of World Records, I looked in and you could see that there was recorded rainfall of 45 inches in a 12-hour period during the tropical storm near Madagascar in 1966. So that's key to helping us determine, well, how much water was really in the canopy. Well, if there's 90 inches per day, and then God said that he sent the flood for our rain for 40 days, and if you multiply that by the surface area of the earth, meaning it's raining constantly all over the entire Earth at 90 inches per day, well, that would give you 300 feet of water after those 40 days. And again, I mentioned about this water canopy basically being a spherical shell. Well, here's the geometric equation for a spherical shell. The 4/3 pi times the outer radius cubed minus the inner radius cubed. Well, we just determined or assumed this orbital altitude. Well, that's going to be that inner radius. And also, we just calculated the volume of water that's in the canopy, or at least that came from the canopy, and that's the V. So now we have only one unknown left, the RO, the outer radius. And so we can solve that equation for the outer radius. And then once we know the outer radius, we just subtract the inner radius from it, and then we have the thickness of the canopy. So that's what we're going to do. And when you do that, I developed this plot here that has in the vertical axis the thickness of the water canopy in feet, and then on the horizontal axis is the rains per day in inches, starting from 0 to 90 inches. And if you look at the very bottom line in the plot, you see the geostationary line that shows for 90 inches of rain, you're going to get a canopy thickness of around 6.85 feet. And I did do other orbits. The lowest orbit you can really have is around 62 miles. And if you do that, the thickness is around almost 300 feet in thickness. 250 miles orbit is what the ISS, International Space Station, orbits at. So it's a little bit less, around 270 feet or so. Then you have mid low Earth orbit, and then also 2,000 miles is the maximum low Earth orbit. So the higher you go in altitude, then the thinner that shell is going to be. And so that canopy thickness we've measured is 6.85 feet for geostationary orbit. Of course, there's no way to confirm the rain rate or the altitude of the water canopy orbit. However, the fact that this analysis shows realistic results is amazing. How could an uneducated prophet, by today's standards, and that's no slam to Moses, who would have wrote Genesis, but he certainly didn't know about orbital mechanics and probably didn't know about how fast the rain rate was and things like that. But he wrote that text there thousands of years ago that hold up under mathematical scrutiny. So this again shows a supernatural component to the Word of God. Another evidence for us that contributes to this result is when we look at the radiation protection that would have resulted from this canopy. Gamma radiation fills the universe. It's the byproduct of stellar events like explosions, etc., and is highly deadly to humans. Science has determined that a protection factor of PF 1000 is needed for the safety of human beings in regard to gamma radiation. This is kind of like the SPF suntan lotion that you put on, SPF 30 or 100, whatever it is. Well, PF 1000 means that 1,000th of the radiation is allowed to pass through. And so that's deemed not enough to hurt humans there. We have to remember the canopy had to be thin enough for the light of the sun, moon, and stars to show, but it still had to be thick enough to block this harmful gamma radiation. Well, there's a list of materials that are used to block gamma radiation. Most of the time they're used in laboratory environments. And of course, lead is a very popular one. You can have 4 inches of lead and it will block enough of the radiation of PF 1000. Of course, iron, steel, and stone. But then when it gets to water, notice that it says 72 inches or 6 feet. Well, we just calculated about 6 feet is what the water canopy was. So this is further evidence to support our analysis showing a 6-foot water shield is necessary to protect against gamma radiation. Of course, this is a little bit of denisology here. This possible scenario for the flood of Noah. We know that multiple asteroids have struck the Earth. And so if they really struck the Earth during the flood of Noah, they would have had to have broken this canopy. This would have been like popping a balloon. It would have caused the canopy to collapse due to these asteroid breaches. So these asteroids impact the Earth, bursting the aquifers. The canopy begins to collapse. Um, and remember that God gave Noah 7 days to gather the animals. The animals probably discern these impacts of the asteroids. Seismic activity ensues from that and causes them to panic, and they head towards Noah at this time. And if you calculate 7 days from when the impacts happened, the water would just have to travel 130 miles an hour. These asteroids are coming in at 35 kilometers a second, so very fast. And so they would have imparted some of their momentum to this water. And of course, gravity is going to pull in the water as well. And so it makes sense that they could get there fairly quickly, even though it's 22,000 miles up. But that's not unheard of by any means. After the 7 days, water reaches the earth and it begins to rain for the first time. And of course, God shuts Noah and his family in the ark, and then the canopy continues to collapse and bring rain to the earth for 40 days. Okay, so we've had these asteroids hit, and so what is that happening to the Earth? We mentioned about tipping of the Earth, and there's some interesting things you can glean from ancient observatories and the alignments that they have around the Earth. But first, let's look at what's a great circle. A great circle is just a circle on the surface of the sphere that lies in a plane passing through the sphere's center. So in navigation, this is kind of an important concept to understand. Is this great circle. We have these location of ancient sites, these ancient observatories, their latitude, longitude. And if you look at the distance between where they're located and how far they're off from a great circle, many of them are very close. We have Giza, that's right on a great circle. So the Machu Picchu is 15 miles from it. Easter Island is right on the same great circle. Um, Petra, 6 miles. The city of uh, 40 miles. Um, and all these are on the same great circle. And so if you plot that on a 2D map, you can see these red dots that show the location of these particular ancient sites. So you really don't get a good understanding of what that really means on a 2D map. So I really need to show you a globe. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, and I'm going to share my video feed here. Could do that. And what I want to show you is a globe, and this is just a typical globe. You can, if I can make it work right. And of course, you see the equator, the typical equator that goes along. Well, this green string that I have represents that great circle I just showed you, where all the different ancient sites, astronomy sites were. So it's very interesting that they all aligned on this great circle. And so you can see where it goes along across the world. So my contention is that this is actually the original equator spot. There's no other way they would have known to be from all across the world to be on that spot other than if they were on the equator. And so originally the Earth, it's currently tilted like this, but if I can make it work right, the Earth used to be like that and rotated along that equator, but the Earth was tilted from these asteroid impacts. So many prehistorical astronomical sites lie on a great circle. The inclination of the great circle suggests that Earth was once tilted 30 degrees from its current tilt. Earth's equator could have once been where these sites are located. This would support much of the previous analysis. And again, Isaiah 24, we read about this earlier about the Earth reeling like a drunkard. It sways like a hut in the wind. And of course, we see the catastrophic event in 2350 with the flood. Of course, Isaiah wrote his in 700 BC. Maybe there was something else that happened in 700 BC, some catastrophe. But days and nights are now varied. Polar ice caps now form. The once worldwide temperature climates are no longer there. Ancient cultures would have recognized that the equator provided a number of advantages for observing the night sky and helping them predict the seasons as well as with religious ceremonies. So there's a reason why they would have been on that great circle. A person standing on that old equator, they would have been able to see stars from both hemispheres, providing optimal visibility. They would have had 12-hour days and 12-hour nights. The sun would rise in the east at the exact same place on the horizon and set in the west at the exact same place. Celestial objects would all pass directly overhead as opposed to being close to the horizon, which reduces the visibility. This theory of the Earth once being more upright would also support the notion of a worldwide temperature climate, and of course supports Isaiah 24. So interesting points: meteor impacts support a tipping of the Earth. The location of these ancient religious observation sites seem to indicate a tipping of the Earth as well. Both meteor analysis and ancient observation sites indicate the Earth was tipped in the same direction, that southerly direction. Isaiah 24 confirms that the Earth is prone to sway like a hut in the wind. So some other worldwide evidences. This is very interesting. You have 41 different people groups all over the world, and each one of them has a legend of the flood. Matter of fact, all of them do. And if you think about, places like Fiji and Hawaii that are out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with really no way to, at least in until modern times, had no way of even knowing anything about what anybody else believed, but yet they still had ancient legends of a destruction by flood. So all 41 had a destruction by flood legend. 38 of them had about humans being saved. 36 of them had a boat that was involved with saving them. 15, one family saved. 14, a flood caused by sin. 10, flood by divine decree. 9 were birds sent out first. 8, animals were saved. 7, survivors worshiped God. 6, boat landed on high mountain. 5, God spoke favor after the flood. So very interesting that these cultures that are come from such different parts of the world would all have similar legends. Probably even more, the most interesting to me really is the Chinese language. It's one of the oldest in the world, probably around 2500 BC, which would be shortly after the flood. It correlates closely with the biblical time frame of the Tower of Babel. And let's just look at some of these ancient Chinese pictographs, as they're called, and to see what they really are the genesis from them. But first, Genesis 2:7, and the Lord formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. That word form means, the Hebrew word yasar, means to create. Genesis 3, then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden of the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man, where are you? So what's the word for to create in Chinese? And this is ancient Chinese, not necessarily current Chinese. But that word to create has multiple uh, pictures within it and multiple definitions within it. So that means to walk plus talk. And then the word for talk means living, dust, and man. So how would the word create have anything to do with living, dust, and man? Pretty interesting there. But the Chinese language provides evidence of creation, the fall, the flood, and after the flood as well. Let's look at some more definitions here. The word for garden means dust, breath, two persons, and enclosure. The word for devil is motion, garden, man, and privately. The word for tempter is devil, trees, and cover. You think, what does that cover mean? Well, in Ezekiel 28, it talks about a description of Lucifer, and God calls him the cherub that covereth. And that word covereth means to protect or guard. I personally believe that Lucifer was in the garden to begin with as an unfallen angel, and he was put there to guard Adam and Eve and to teach them and help them and make and protect them, keep them from getting hurt or something like that. But he was the cherub that covereth. The word for desire or covet is trees plus woman. The word for flood, this is really interesting. You have the number 8, united plus earth, which equals total plus water. So why would the word flood have anything to do with the number 8? The word for large ship, again, the word 8 shows up, person and boat. So the written Chinese language is dated to approximately 2500 BC, correlating closely to just after the flood, right after the Tower of Babel. We also see some more here, God's interaction with man. The word God means reveal plus man plus garden. The word talk means dust, breath, and alive. The word happiness or blessing means God, one, man, and garden. See the sacrificial system. Righteousness is sheep plus me. See God's command, the word forbidden, 2 trees plus command. Remember, there are 2 trees in the garden, that tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then the tree of life. The cursing of the ground, sorrow, is ancient and weeds. The word for migrate is great, division, west, and walk. Also, a couple insights into that word for garden. We know that from the scripture, a single river from the land of Eden flowed into the garden and formed 4 rivers. Eden seems to have been a larger place that included a garden in which man was placed. 4 rivers were formed from the single river that flowed into the Garden of Eden: the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and Euphrates, Genesis 2. So notice the Chinese symbol for garden has 4 lines representing 4 rivers. And this is very interesting. The word for empty there's that word 8 again, 8 plus roof, which means cave plus work. So it provides a hint of what happened after Noah's Ark landed. Noah and his family of 8 apparently worked to empty the contents of the ark into a cave where they took up an initial residence. Noah and his family were the very first post-flood cavemen. So without a doubt, the ancient Chinese language hints at many biblical references and gives insights into the early life of mankind. So just a quick review. We see that fossil layers, rock formations, legends, Chinese language, and more all point to evidence that a global flood destroyed the ancient world. Wrong assumptions made about the fossil layer, as well as the ignoring of catastrophic influences on radioactive decay, have caused false long ages to be applied to dating methods. Then we saw that Satan tried to defile the human bloodline with his seed. God sent the flood to keep the bloodline of mankind pure, to allow Jesus to be born. And still, we're just really have just breached the surface. I mean, there's so much more that we could talk about for year after year, probably. But so much evidence for a young Earth through the science of geology. So if you have more interest, the Institute for Creation Research has a lot of papers on their website that you can, has a good search engine that you can search out different topics on. So I encourage you to do that if you have that interest. But I hope you enjoyed that. That's a lot of information, but hope you benefited from that talk. So thank you. We'll look forward to seeing you next week. We'll be delving into paleontology, the study of dinosaurs, coming up. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.